London, April 1817. The air inside White's Gentlemen's Club hung thick with tobacco smoke and the particular stench of masculine privilege, that mingling of brandy, sweat, and the casual cruelty of men who had never known consequence. Beatrice Thornhill stood in the shadowed alcove near the card-room, her heart hammering against her ribs with such force she feared it might betray her presence. The borrowed coat hung loose on her slender frame, the hat pulled low over features she had darkened with ash, and yet she felt exposed, as though every man in that hallowed sanctuary of male domain could see through her disguise to the desperate woman beneath. She had come for George, her brother, her foolish, reckless, beloved brother, who had promised this would be the last time, who had sworn on their mother's grave he would never again touch a card or cast a die. Through the doorway she could see him now, slumped in a chair like a marionette with cut strings, his face the colour of old paper. Across from him sat Lord Richard Carstairs, a man whose reputation preceded him like the smell of rot, his smile wide and cold as he surveyed the wreckage of George's fortune with evident satisfaction. Beatrice moved closer, close enough to hear Carstairs's voice, smooth as oil on water. "The estate," he was saying. Thornhill Manor itself. George had wagered it and lost. Their last remaining property, the final thread connecting them to respectability, gone in a single disastrous hand of Vingt-et-un. The room tilted, and Beatrice gripped the doorframe. Then Carstairs looked up, and his eyes found her in the shadows, and she knew with absolute certainty that her disguise had never fooled him at all. He had been waiting for her. "Come, Miss Thornhill," he said, his voice cutting through the murmur of the club. "Let us discuss terms." She stepped forward because there was nothing else to do, because George's ruination was hers as well, because a woman of 28 with no fortune and a family name already tarnished by scandal had no choices left but the ones offered by men like this. Carstairs gestured to the chair beside him, and she sat, feeling the eyes of the other men slide away in embarrassment or excitement. "There is a boxing match in 10 days, Carstairs said, leaning back with the satisfied air of a cat before cream. "The Duke of Westmont fights. Perhaps you have heard of him." She had. Everyone had. Alexander Pembroke, Duke of Westmont, who had taken up the vulgar sport of pugilism with unnatural dedication, who had never lost a match, whose physical prowess was matched only by his social aloofness. Carstairs continued, "I propose a wager, Miss Thornhill. If the Duke loses, your brother's debt is forgiven, the estate returned. If the Duke wins, however, you will come to me, as my mistress, for as long as I wish to keep you." The words hung in the air like poison. Beatrice looked at her brother, saw him raise his head, saw the horror dawn across his face too late, always too late. She thought of the Duke's reputation, undefeated, unstoppable. She thought of the empty house waiting for them, the creditors circling like wolves. She thought of the word mistress and what it meant, the ruin it promised. And because she was desperate, because she was cornered, because in that moment she could see no other path forward, Beatrice Thornhill heard herself speak. "I accept." Dawn arrived cold and pale over London, touching the windows of the Duke of Westmont's private training establishment with fingers of thin silver light, and Alexander Pembroke was already awake, already dressed in the plain canvas trousers and linen shirt that constituted his uniform in this space. Where titles meant nothing and only strength, skill, and discipline held currency. He had been awake for hours, truth be told, sleep being a luxury he had long ago sacrificed to the rigorous demands he placed upon himself, demands that transformed his body into something harder than the aristocratic softness expected of his station. The gymnasium occupied the converted carriage house behind his London residence, a space he had claimed for himself 5 years earlier after returning from the continent, after the broken engagement, after the disillusionment that came with understanding that society valued appearance over substance, wealth over character, and that a man might be surrounded by hundreds at every ball and soiree and still find himself utterly alone. Here, in this realm of sweat and impact, of measured breathing and controlled violence, he found something approximating peace, or at least a temporary reprieve from the suffocating weight of ducal responsibility. His trainer, John Hartley, a former champion who had risen from the bare-knuckle rings of the East End to respectability through skill and savagery, was already waiting, his weathered face impassive, as he watched Alexander wrap his hands with methodical precision. "The bout is attracting unusual attention," Hartley said without preamble, his voice rough as gravel. "Heavy betting from quarters that do not normally concern themselves with pugilism." Alexander said nothing, continuing the familiar ritual of preparation, feeling the linen strips tighten across his knuckles, the slight give and pull that would protect bone and tendon when fist met flesh. He had contempt for the gambling culture that surrounded the sport, for the dissolute men who saw in violence only an opportunity for profit, who would wager fortunes on the suffering of others without a single thought to honor or consequence. "Lord Carstairs has placed a particularly large sum on your victory," Hartley continued, watching him with the sharp assessment of a man who had made his living reading opponents. Interesting choice, given the man has never shown interest in sport before. Alexander looked up then, his pale blue eyes cold and steady. Carstairs. The name alone left a taste like copper in his mouth. He knew the man by reputation, knew him as one knew a species of poisonous serpent by the trail of destruction left in his wake. "What stakes?" Alexander asked quietly. Hartley shrugged, but there was something uneasy in his expression. "Rumor speaks of property, of personal wagers beyond mere money. The quality have made a spectacle of it." Alexander returned to wrapping his hands, but something had shifted in the air around him, some presentiment of complication. He thought of his own past, of Eleanor, his younger sister, dead these 3 years, who had been compromised by just such a man, cast out by society, driven to desperation, and finally to the bridge from which she had thrown herself into the Thames on a November night while he had been abroad, unaware, unable to protect her as an older brother should. He had learned then that the elegant world of the ton concealed rot beneath its glittering surface, that honor was a word spoken often and practiced rarely, and that women were the perpetual victims of a system designed by men for the benefit of men. He had returned to England changed, harder, and had taken up pugilism not merely for sport, but as a form of penance, a way to punish the body that had failed to be present when needed most. "You will win," Hartley said. Statement, not question. Alexander flexed his wrapped hands, felt the familiar readiness settle into his muscles, the cold clarity that came before combat. "Yes," he said simply. "I will win. And now's the time to stop and subscribe to our channel. Every subscriber brings us closer to 1,000, which helps us keep these stories alive and coming your way. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like it and drop a comment telling us where you're watching from. It's always amazing to see how far these tales travel across the world. Now let's continue. Lady Margaret Sinclair's afternoon salon occupied the first floor of her Mayfair residence, a series of interconnected rooms decorated in shades of cream and gold, where the light fell soft through gauze curtains, and the air carried the scent of hothouse roses. And it was here that Beatrice found herself 3 days after that catastrophic night at White's, moving through the assembled guests with a composure that cost her every ounce of strength she possessed. The usual gathering of women filled the space with their rustling silks and careful conversation. matrons and debutantes, and those like Beatrice herself, who occupied that uncertain territory between youth and confirmed spinsterhood. And she had come because Lady Margaret had sent a pointed invitation, and because remaining alone in the small rented rooms she shared with George would have driven her to madness with the weight of what she had done, what she had agreed to become. She accepted tea from a servant and positioned herself near the windows, where she might observe without participating fully. But her attention snagged immediately on a conversation taking place near the pianoforte, where three younger women had clustered together with the particular energy of those sharing delicious scandal. "The Duke of Westmont," one was saying, her voice pitched to carry just far enough. "They say he trains like a common prize fighter, that he has actually bloodied his hands in the ring." Another responded with practiced shock. "My brother attended one of his matches and said the Duke displays a savagery quite at odds with his station, that he fights as though pursued by demons." The third leaned in, her expression avid. Lord Havisham attempted to engage him in conversation at the Rothschild ball last season, and received such a cold reception that he vowed never to approach the man again. They say the Duke has no interest in society, in marriage, in anything beyond his brutal sport. Beatrice felt something cold settle in her chest as she listened, understanding with each word the impossibility of what lay before her. This was the man on whose defeat her entire future balanced. A man described in tones of awe and fear, undefeated, unsociable, dedicated to violence with an intensity that frightened even his peers. She set down her teacup with a hand that trembled only slightly, and found Lady Margaret watching her from across the room with an expression of concern that threatened to undo what remained of her composure. Within moments, the older woman had crossed to her side and taken her arm with gentle firmness, steering her toward a small withdrawing room that opened off the main salon. The door closed behind them with a soft click that seemed impossibly loud in the sudden quiet, and Lady Margaret turned to face her with eyes that had known her since childhood, that had watched her family's decline with sympathy, but without the power to prevent it. "My dear, what has happened?" Lady Margaret said, not asked, her voice low and urgent. "You look as though you have not slept in days." And so Beatrice, because she could not bear the weight alone any longer, because Lady Margaret was perhaps the only person left in London who might help without judgment, told her everything, the words spilling out in a rush that left her breathless and shaking, the gambling debt and Carstairs, and the terrible wager and the boxing match now only 7 days away. Lady Margaret listened in silence that deepened with each revelation, her face growing pale, one hand rising to press against her throat. And when Beatrice finally fell silent, the older woman stood motionless for a long moment before speaking. "We must approach the Duke directly," she said, her voice steady, despite the shock evident in her expression. The address Lady Margaret provided led Beatrice through streets she would not ordinarily venture into alone. Neighborhoods where commerce and labor held sway over elegance, where the buildings crouched low and practical against the grey morning sky, and she pulled her cloak more tightly around herself as she approached the converted carriage house behind the Duke's residence, feeling her heart hammer against her ribs with a force that rivaled the sounds emerging from within, sounds of impact and exertion and male voices calling encouragement or instruction. She had left Lady Margaret waiting in the carriage 2 streets away, insisting on this approach alone, knowing that her cause was desperate enough without appearing to require a chaperone for what was already a scandalous errand. And now, as she stood before the side entrance, she felt the full weight of what she was attempting, the audacity of a woman entering a space dedicated to violence and masculine competition. The door opened to her tentative knock, and a young man in shirt sleeves looked at her with undisguised shock. before she asked in a voice steadier than she felt if she might observe the training. And something in her bearing must have convinced him, because he stepped aside with obvious reluctance and gestured her into the dim interior. The space opened before her like a vision of some ancient arena, all rough wood and exposed beams, and light falling in dusty shafts through high windows. And the smell struck her immediately. Leather and sweat and something else she could not name, but recognized as the scent of bodies pushed to their limits. Perhaps a dozen men occupied the space, some working at heavy bags suspended from chains, others engaged in grappling or footwork drills, but her attention fixed immediately on the raised platform in the center, where two men circled each other with careful intensity. And even before she recognized the Duke of Westmont, she felt the authority of his presence, the way the other men tracked his movement with respect, bordering on reverence. He wore only canvas trousers and a thin shirt darkened with perspiration, his hands wrapped in strips of cloth. And as she watched, he moved with a precision and power that took her breath. Each strike controlled yet devastating, each defensive movement economical and certain. His opponent, a larger man with the build of a professional pugilist, could not seem to penetrate his guard, and Beatrice found herself simultaneously fascinated and horrified by the casual violence, the way flesh met flesh with sounds that made her flinch. This was the man on whom her entire future depended, and watching him dismantle his opponent with methodical efficiency, she felt her last fragile hope crumble, because there was simply no possibility that such a man could lose, no chance that he would stumble or fail when every movement spoke of absolute mastery. The bout ended with the Duke landing a combination of strikes that sent his opponent staggering, and as the other men called out appreciation, she stood frozen near the wall, suddenly aware of how thoroughly she did not belong in this space, how completely she had stepped outside the boundaries of acceptable feminine behavior. And then the Duke turned, his pale eyes sweeping the room in assessment, and his gaze found her across the crowded space, held her with an intensity that made her feel stripped bare despite being fully clothed. And for a long moment neither moved, caught in that first electric recognition, the moment when two souls perceive each other across the distance that separates all human beings and know, without understanding how or why, that their fates have just become irrevocably entangled. Alexander Pembroke crossed the training floor with the same economy of movement he brought to everything, still breathing hard from exertion, but his expression giving nothing away. And Beatrice felt her throat tighten as he approached, as the space between them diminished, and she could see the details that distance had obscured, the pale grey of his eyes like winter light, the thin scar that traced his left eyebrow, the way perspiration darkened his hair at the temples and made the linen of his shirt cling to the hard planes of his chest and shoulders. He stopped an appropriate distance away, though what was appropriate in such circumstances she could not begin to guess, and his gaze travelled over her with an assessment that felt physical, taking in her modest dress and careful posture, and the way her hands gripped her reticule as though it might anchor her to propriety. "Madam," he said, his voice low and carrying the slight roughness of recent exertion, "this is an unusual place to find a woman of quality." She lifted her chin, refusing to be cowed despite the heat rising in her cheeks, and met his eyes with all the courage she could summon. "Your Grace, I must beg a moment of your time on a matter of extreme urgency and delicacy." Something flickered in his expression, curiosity perhaps, or annoyance, but he gestured toward a door at the far end of the hall, and she followed him, acutely aware of the eyes tracking their progress, the speculation that would doubtless follow her presence here. The room he led her to was small and spare, containing only a bench and hooks for clothing, and when he closed the door, the sounds of training became muffled, creating an intimacy that made her pulse quicken. "Speak," he said, not unkindly but without particular warmth, and she forced herself to begin, laying out the facts of her situation with as much dignity as she could preserve. Her brother's debt, Carstairs's wager, the terms that would make her that man's mistress if the Duke won his scheduled match. She did not beg, would not demean herself or him with tears or pleading, but simply presented the truth and watched his face for any sign of softening. When she finished, he stood silent for a long moment, his expression unreadable, and then he said with finality that struck her like a blow, "I do not throw fights, Miss Thornhill. Whatever your circumstances, I cannot compromise my honor or the integrity of the sport for any reason." She had expected this, had known even as she made her way here that this would be his answer, but hearing the words spoken aloud brought a crushing weight of despair that nearly buckled her knees, and she nodded once, carefully, afraid that any greater movement would shatter the composure she was barely maintaining. "Of course, Your Grace. I apologize for the intrusion." She turned toward the door, each step requiring conscious effort, and her hand had just reached for the handle when his voice stopped her. "Why would you make such a wager?" The question hung in the air between them, and she turned back slowly, finding him watching her with an intensity that made her breath catch. "Because I had no other choice," she said simply, and in her voice was all the weariness of years spent navigating a world that offered women like her no real choices at all, only the illusion of agency in a system designed to constrain them at every turn. The silence stretched between them, weighted with the enormity of her admission, and Alexander found himself studying her with new attention, seeing past the careful composure to the exhaustion that shadowed her eyes, the tension that held her spine too straight, and when he gestured to the bench, she hesitated only a moment before sinking onto it with a relief that spoke of burdens carried too long without respite. "Tell me," he said, his tone gentler now, and she lifted her gaze to his with a directness he had not expected, a refusal to hide behind the feminine arts of deflection or appeal to pity. "My father died 2 years ago," she began, her voice steady, though he could hear the effort required to maintain it. "We thought ourselves secure. A modest fortune, but sufficient for George to make his way and for me to live respectably. But after the funeral, when his man of business completed the accounting, we discovered that my father had been paying debts for years, obligations incurred in his youth that he had never mentioned to anyone, and what we thought was security proved to be nothing more than a carefully maintained illusion. The estate was mortgaged, the investments had been sold years before, and we were left with only the London house and a quarterly income barely sufficient to maintain appearances." She paused, her hands twisting in her lap before she stilled them consciously. "George is not a bad man, Your Grace, merely a weak one, and he fell into the company of men who encouraged his worst instincts, men who saw his desperation and exploited it with promises of easy fortune through cards and dice. I tried to counsel him, to manage what little we had, but I am only his sister, and he would not hear wisdom from a woman when Lord Carstairs and others whispered in his ear that his luck would change, that the next hand would restore everything. Alexander felt a familiar anger stirring, the rage he carried for a system that created such vulnerabilities, and the predators who fed upon them. "And the wager?" he prompted. She met his eyes without flinching. "When I arrived at the club last night, George had already lost the house, our last asset, and Carstairs proposed the wager almost as an afterthought, a jest among gentlemen, I believed. If you lost, the debt would be forgiven. If you won, I would be his. I accepted because I thought I might negotiate with Carstairs privately, appeal to whatever honor he possessed. But when I made inquiries this morning, I learned the nature of the man I had bargained with, that he collects women as others collect art, uses them and discards them, and that there would be no negotiation, no appeal to mercy. Alexander felt something shift in his chest, a crack in the armor he maintained against the world's pain. "What would you do?" he asked quietly. "If I refuse, and Carstairs claims his prize?" She looked at him for a long moment, and in her face he saw a resignation that pierced him more deeply than any blow he had taken in the ring. "I would endure it, Your Grace," she said simply. "I would find a way to survive, as women have always done when the world leaves them no other choice. I would endure until I could not. And then I suppose I would follow whatever path remained to me." The answer affected him profoundly, not because of any appeal to his emotions, but because of its absolute honesty, the recognition in her words of a truth he had spent years trying to ignore, that for every man like him who could fight his way to agency, there were countless women who possessed no such option, whose dignity and will meant nothing against the casual cruelty of men with power. After Beatrice departed, Alexander remained in the small training room for longer than he intended, staring at the door through which she had passed, and finding himself unable to dismiss her situation with the cold pragmatism he had cultivated over years of managing his position and protecting himself from the endless demands of those who would exploit his rank or wealth. He returned to the training floor and completed his scheduled exercises with mechanical precision, but his mind circled endlessly around her words, the quiet dignity with which she had presented her impossible circumstances, the resignation in her voice when she spoke of endurance, and he found himself gripped by an anger that grew with each repetition of the memory. Fury not at her, but at the entire corrupt edifice of a society that could reduce a woman of obvious intelligence and character to nothing more than a wager between dissolute men. That evening in his study, he sent for his man of affairs and made inquiries about Lord Carstairs, and what he learned over the following 24 hours turned his anger to something colder and more implacable. Carstairs was known among a certain set for his collection of mistresses, women he acquired through debts and wagers and discarded when their novelty faded, leaving them ruined and without recourse. And there were whispers of cruelty, of women who had disappeared into the countryside, bearing marks of violence. And Alexander felt a visceral loathing rise in his throat as he contemplated Beatrice in such a man's power. He thought of his sister Catherine, dead, these 5 years now, who had been compromised by a viscount who promised marriage and delivered abandonment, and how she had borne the social exit and family shame until the weight of it became unbearable, and she had walked into the lake at their country estate one autumn morning and not returned. He had been 23 then, newly come into his title after his father's sudden death, and he had been powerless to protect her from the gossip and the closed doors and the slow suffocation of a world that punished women for the sins of men. He had buried his grief in the discipline of pugilism, in the clarity of physical contest where strength and skill mattered more than rank or reputation, but the rage had never truly left him, only found new channels. And now, as he sat alone in his study, with reports of Carstairs's depredations spread before him, he felt that old fury kindle into something purposeful. The code he lived by demanded integrity in all things, demanded that he not compromise the sport he loved or his own honor for any consideration. But as he weighed that principle against the certainty of Beatrice's destruction, as he remembered the exhaustion in her eyes and the quiet way she had spoken of endurance, he found himself questioning whether honor that turned away from such suffering was truly honorable at all, or merely another form of the selfishness that allowed men like Carstairs to flourish unchecked. By dawn he had made his decision, one that surprised him with its clarity once he allowed himself to consider it, and he penned a brief message to be delivered to Miss Beatrice Thornhill at Lady Margaret Sinclair's residence, stating simply that he would reconsider her request, and inviting her to call upon him the following afternoon to discuss terms that might prove mutually satisfactory. Beatrice received the message the following morning as she sat with Lady Margaret over tea, and her hands trembled slightly as she broke the seal and read the brief lines, her heart lurching between hope and dread at the prospect of meeting the Duke again, and Lady Margaret watched her face with keen attention before asking what news had arrived and whether it brought comfort or further complication. "He will see me," Beatrice said quietly, her voice barely steady. "He says he will reconsider, that we might discuss terms that prove mutually satisfactory, though I cannot imagine what terms might exist that would induce a man of his reputation to throw a fight and compromise everything he stands for in the sport he clearly values above all else." Lady Margaret reached across to squeeze her hand with an encouragement Beatrice wished she could feel, and the hours until the appointed meeting passed with excruciating slowness, each minute weighted with speculation and fear about what the Duke might demand in exchange for his intervention. When she arrived at his residence that afternoon, she was shown into a private study lined with books and furnished with austere elegance, and Alexander rose from behind a massive desk as she entered, his expression unreadable as he gestured for her to sit in the chair opposite him, the formality of the setting doing nothing to ease the tension that thrummed through her body. "Miss Thornhill," he began without preamble, "I have considered your situation carefully, and made inquiries into Lord Carstairs that confirm my initial assessment of his character, and I find I cannot in good conscience allow him to claim his prize regardless of the cost to my own reputation in the sporting world." Beatrice felt relief flood through her so intensely she feared she might weep, but she held herself still as he continued, his gaze steady and penetrating. "However, I do not act from pure charity, and there are terms I must insist upon if I am to take this action." She had known this moment would come, the reckoning where she learned the true price of her salvation, and she steeled herself for demands that would differ from Carstairs only in the veneer of honor that might soften their edges but not change their essential nature. She nodded once, her voice deserting her, and watched as something shifted in his expression, a gentleness entering his eyes that surprised her. "I will lose the fight intentionally," he said, "and in doing so will void Carstairs' claim upon you. But in exchange you will agree to spend 1 month in my household under my protection, residing here as my guest and companion." The words hung between them, and Beatrice felt her breath catch as she tried to pass their meaning, to understand what companion might entail, and what protections, if any, she might claim within the arrangement. Her face must have betrayed her thoughts, because Alexander leaned forward slightly, his expression earnest in a way that seemed at odds with his usual austere control. "I see you anticipate demands similar to those Carstairs would make," he said quietly, "and I cannot fault you for that assumption given the world we inhabit, but I assure you my terms are different in substance and not merely in presentation. You will have your own rooms, your own space, and I will make no physical demands upon you whatsoever. What I ask is your company, your conversation, your honesty in discourse. At the end of the month, you will be free to leave if you choose, and I will provide you with sufficient funds to establish yourself independently. If you wish to remain, we will negotiate whatever further arrangements seem appropriate to us both." Beatrice stared at him, searching his face for deception or hidden intent, and finding only a peculiar vulnerability in his gaze, as though he too was taking a risk whose outcome remained uncertain. And after a long moment she heard herself say, "I accept your terms, Your Grace, though I confess I do not fully understand them, or why you would offer such generous conditions when you might demand far more, and I would have no power to refuse." Alexander smiled then, a small expression that transformed his severe features into something almost gentle, and he replied, "Perhaps that is precisely why I offer them, Miss Thornhill, because you would have no power to refuse. And I find I have no taste for arrangements built on desperation rather than choice. And in this, at least, we might both find something more honorable than the corruption that surrounds us. The night of the boxing match arrived with the weight of inevitability, and Beatrice found herself seated in the private gallery of Lord Ashworth's country estate, where the bout was to take place. The vast room transformed into a temple of masculine indulgence, with ropes marking the fighting square in the center, and rows of chairs arranged in ascending tiers to afford every spectator a clear view of the violence to come. The air hung thick with tobacco smoke and expensive cologne, with the sharp scent of brandy and the musk of too many bodies pressed close together in anticipation of blood sport. And everywhere she looked, Beatrice saw faces flushed with drink and excitement, men wagering enormous sums with casual gestures, their voices rising in speculation about the outcome, and boasts about their own predictions. Lord Carstairs sat beside her with possessive confidence, his hand occasionally brushing her arm in a presumption of ownership that made her skin crawl, and he spoke loudly to his companions about the certainty of the Duke's victory and the prize he would claim afterward. His words crude enough that Beatrice felt heat rise in her cheeks, though she kept her gaze fixed forward and her expression carefully blank. The crowd's noise swelled to a roar as Alexander entered through a side door, stripped to the waist with his hands wrapped in the traditional manner, his body a sculpture of controlled power that drew appreciative shouts from the assembly. And Beatrice felt her breath catch at the sight of him, at the dangerous grace with which he moved, and the absolute focus evident in every line of his form. He stepped into the roped square and began his preparatory movements, the loose stretches and practice strikes that fighters employed to ready their bodies for combat. And then, as though drawn by some invisible thread, his gaze swept the gallery until it found her among the crowd, and for a single suspended moment their eyes met across the distance, and smoke, and noise. In that look, Beatrice saw acknowledgement and reassurance, and something else she could not quite name, an intensity of purpose that steadied the wild beating of her heart, and she managed the smallest nod in return before Carstairs demanded her attention with some coarse remark that she barely heard over the thundering of blood in her ears. The opposing fighter entered then, a man of similar build to Alexander, but coarser in feature and movement, and the crowd's excitement reached fever pitch as the referee called both men to the center and recited the rules that would govern the contest. At the signal they began to circle one another with the cautious assessment of predators, and Beatrice watched Alexander's face transform into a mask of concentration as he engaged in the dance of feint and counter that marked the opening of any serious bout. But she alone, perhaps in all that assembly, knew that behind that mask he was calculating something far more complex than simple victory, weighing each movement against the larger purpose they had agreed upon, struggling between the instinct and training that demanded he fight with every ounce of his considerable skill, and the decision that required he engineer his own defeat, convincingly enough to satisfy the crowd, but deliberately enough to achieve their shared goal. The first 6 rounds passed in a blur of controlled violence, with Alexander taking more strikes than Beatrice had expected, absorbing blows that made her flinch in sympathetic pain, while the crowd roared its approval at the unexpectedly competitive nature of the bout, and she could see the calculation in every movement he made, the way he left openings that should not have existed, and failed to press advantages that his skill should have exploited. And yet he did it all so skillfully that none but she seemed to notice the deliberate nature of his disadvantage. Then, in the 7th round, his opponent landed a heavy blow to Alexander's jaw that snapped his head back with brutal force, and Beatrice watched in horror as his knees buckled, and he went down onto the canvas with a thunderous impact that silenced the crowd for one suspended heartbeat before pandemonium erupted around her. Carstairs leapt to his feet with a shout of triumph that cut through her like a blade, his hand clamping onto her arm with possessive cruelty as he crowed about his victory and the prize he had won, and Beatrice felt the world narrow to a single point of despair as she watched Alexander lie motionless within the roped square, wondering if he had truly sacrificed himself for her sake, or if the blow had been harder than anticipated and caused real harm beyond the theatrical fall they had planned. But then Alexander stirred, pushing himself up onto his hands with visible effort, and the referee began the count in a voice that seemed to come from very far away. And at the count of 8, Alexander rose to his feet, with blood trickling from the corner of his mouth and his eyes blazing with something that looked less like defeat and more like absolute determination. The referee checked him and declared the bout concluded, the victory awarded to his opponent, and the crowd's noise swelled to deafening levels as money changed hands and men shouted their disbelief at the upset. But Alexander raised one hand for silence with such commanding authority that even in apparent defeat, he dominated the room, and gradually the assembly quieted enough for his voice to carry across the space. "Lord Carstairs," he said with perfect clarity, "you have witnessed my defeat, and by the terms of your wager the debt owed by George Thornhill is hereby satisfied, but I claim now a wager of my own making, one agreed upon with Miss Beatrice Thornhill herself, that places her under my protection for a period of 1 month, beginning this very night." The words fell like stones into still water, sending ripples of shock and speculation through the gathered crowd, and Beatrice felt Carstairs' hand tighten painfully on her arm as fury contorted his features. But before he could speak, Alexander continued with ice in his voice. "Any man who disputes my claim disputes my honor, and will answer for it accordingly. And I trust there are witnesses enough here to attest that Miss Thornhill came to this gathering under duress and leaves it now of her own free choice under my protection." He looked directly at her, then across the crowd and chaos, and Beatrice found herself standing on trembling legs and walking toward the roped square as though pulled by invisible threads, aware of every eye upon her and every whispered speculation, but caring for none of it. And when she reached him, Alexander extended his hand to help her through the ropes with a gentleness that belied his battered state, and she took it feeling both profound relief and absolute terror at what they had just set in motion together. The carriage journey to Alexander's London residence passed in a blur of sensation for Beatrice, the swaying motion and the muffled sound of hooves on cobblestones seeming to come from very far away as she sat across from the Duke with a thick blanket someone had draped over her shoulders and tried to comprehend the enormity of what had just occurred, that she had walked away from Carstairs and entered into Alexander's protection before an assembly of witnesses who would carry the tale across London by morning, and when the carriage finally stopped before a grand townhouse in Mayfair, with its white stone facade gleaming in the lamplight, she felt a flutter of pure terror at what she was entering. Alexander handed her down with careful courtesy, despite his obvious exhaustion and the bruises already darkening along his jaw, and a small army of servants appeared at the entrance with expressions of professional neutrality that did not quite conceal their surprise at their master arriving home with a woman in tow after losing a public boxing match. The butler, an austere man of perhaps 60 years with silver hair and impeccable bearing, managed only the briefest widening of his eyes before bowing and welcoming them both inside, and Beatrice found herself standing in an entrance hall of such magnificence that she felt her poverty anew, with marble floors and soaring ceilings and a massive chandelier that cast warm light over furnishings worth more than her family had possessed, even in their better days. Alexander spoke briefly to his staff in low tones, issuing instructions that Beatrice could not quite hear, and then he turned to her with a formality that seemed almost absurd after the intimacy of what they had endured together, and said that Mrs. Carson, the housekeeper, would show her to her rooms, and that she should rest and refresh herself and that they would speak more fully in the morning, when they were both recovered from the evening's events. The housekeeper materialized as though summoned by thought alone, a woman of middle years with a kind face and shrewd eyes, who curtsied to Beatrice with a respect that felt both unearned and desperately welcome. And then Beatrice was being led up a sweeping staircase to the second floor and down a corridor hung with portraits of Pembroke ancestors who stared down with aristocratic hauteur at this interloper in their domain. The suite of rooms into which Mrs. Carson ushered her took Beatrice's breath away with their scale and elegance, a sitting room decorated in shades of cream and gold leading into a bedchamber with an enormous four-poster bed and windows that overlooked the dark garden below. And the housekeeper explained in gentle tones that hot water would be brought immediately, and that clothing had been arranged though alterations would be needed, and that Beatrice had only to ring if she required anything at all, treating her not as the fallen woman society would name her, but as an honored guest whose comfort mattered. After the woman departed, Beatrice stood alone in the center of the beautiful room and felt the full weight of her transformation, from desperate woman wagered like property to resident in a ducal household. Safe for the moment, but profoundly uncertain of what the month ahead would demand of her, and whether Alexander's promise of restraint would hold against the reality of proximity and his absolute power over her circumstances. The first morning Beatrice woke in Alexander's household, she lay disoriented in the enormous bed, surrounded by unfamiliar luxury, the silk sheets cool against her skin and the light filtering through curtains far finer than any she had known, and for several moments she could not quite remember how she had arrived in this place before memory returned in a rush that brought both relief and renewed anxiety about the month ahead and what it would demand of her. A maid appeared with hot water and clothing laid out with careful attention, treating Beatrice with a deference that felt strange and unearned. And when she descended to the breakfast room, she found it empty, save for a note in bold handwriting informing her that Alexander had risen early for his training, and that she should make herself at home, and that he hoped she would join him for dinner that evening at 7 o'clock. The day stretched before her with peculiar emptiness, and she explored the public rooms with cautious steps, examining the fine paintings and well-stocked shelves, while servants moved efficiently about their duties and nodded respectfully when they passed her. And she wondered what instructions Alexander had given them about her presence, and whether they judged her as harshly as society surely would. In the afternoon she discovered the library, a magnificent room lined floor to ceiling with books that made her breath catch with longing, and she was standing before a shelf of poetry when Mrs. Carson found her and mentioned gently that His Grace had expressly said Miss Thornhill should feel welcome to read anything she wished, and Beatrice selected a volume with trembling hands and spent the remaining hours lost in verses she had not had access to in years. When evening came, she dressed with care in one of the gowns that had been provided, a simple but elegant creation in deep blue that fit reasonably well, and descended to find Alexander waiting in a small dining room far more intimate than the grand formal space she had glimpsed earlier. And he rose when she entered, with visible evidence of his fight still marking his face, but his manner composed and courteous. Their conversation began with careful formality as servants brought course after course of beautifully prepared food, discussing neutral topics like the weather and the quality of the season. But gradually as the meal progressed, Alexander asked her opinion on a book he had been reading, and Beatrice found herself responding with genuine enthusiasm, her educated mind freed from the necessity of pretending ignorance that society usually demanded of women. He listened with apparent interest as she discussed philosophy and literature, asking questions that revealed his own considerable learning, and she realized with surprise that he truly wanted to hear her thoughts rather than simply tolerating her presence, and the conversation deepened into a genuine exchange of ideas that made the hours pass unnoticed until the clock struck 10, and Alexander remarked, with what seemed like reluctance, that she must be tired from the previous day's ordeal. As Beatrice retired to her rooms that night, she felt the first small loosening of the tight anxiety that had gripped her since the initial wager. Not quite hope, but something adjacent to it. A sense that perhaps this month would not be the torment she had feared, but rather something she could not yet name. And she fell asleep thinking of the way Alexander's eyes had lit with genuine pleasure when she had made a particularly insightful observation about a passage from Milton, as though her mind was something he valued rather than merely tolerated. The news of Beatrice Thornhill's residence in the Duke of Westmont's household spread through London society with the speed and fervour of wildfire through dry timber, carried on whispered conversations in drawing-rooms and shouted across card tables in clubs. And within 3 days of the boxing match, there was hardly a person of quality in the city who had not heard some version of the scandal and formed an opinion about the fallen woman who had moved into the Duke's protection. Lady Margaret arrived on the 4th afternoon in a state of visible agitation, her usually composed features drawn, with worry as Mrs. Carson showed her into the sitting-room where Beatrice had been reading, and the older woman embraced her with a fierceness that spoke of genuine affection before stepping back to examine her face as though searching for signs of mistreatment or distress. The conversation that followed required all of Beatrice's composure as Lady Margaret detailed the things being said in society, the assumptions being made about the nature of her arrangement with Alexander, the doors that were closing to her even as they spoke. And though her friend's concern was motivated by love, Beatrice found herself strangely unmoved by the catalogue of social destruction, because what did she truly have left to lose when her reputation had been compromised the moment she entered that gentleman's club in disguise and made a wager involving her own virtue? She admitted as much to Lady Margaret, speaking with a calmness that seemed to surprise them both, explaining that her fall from respectability had begun long before Alexander's intervention, and that the month in his household would at least be spent in comfort and intellectual stimulation rather than in Carstairs' brutal keeping, and though she did not say it aloud, she realized as she spoke that something else was happening beneath her rational acceptance of ruin, something that felt dangerously like hope. Lady Margaret studied her with shrewd eyes that missed very little, and asked gently whether the Duke had treated her with respect, and Beatrice found her cheeks warming as she described their dinner conversations, and the way Alexander listened to her opinions as though they mattered, and her friend's expression softened into something like understanding mixed with concern. After Lady Margaret departed with promises to call again soon and assurances that true friends would not abandon her, Beatrice sat alone in the elegant sitting-room and acknowledged to herself what she had not quite dared to think clearly before, that she was developing a genuine affection for Alexander's company that went beyond gratitude for his rescue, and that the prospect of leaving at the month's end was beginning to cause an ache in her chest she did not want to examine too closely. That evening, when Alexander returned from his afternoon business and found her in the drawing-room, he mentioned almost casually that he had something to show her if she would accompany him, and he led her through corridors she had not yet explored to a set of double doors which he opened to reveal a private library, even more magnificent than the public one she had discovered earlier, with walls of books rising to a ceiling painted with classical scenes and comfortable chairs positioned near tall windows and a massive desk covered with papers and volumes. He told her simply that this was his personal collection, the books he valued most, and that she should consider herself welcome here whenever she wished, that anything she desired to read was hers, to take, and the gift of such access and trust moved her so profoundly that she felt tears prick her eyes even as she tried to maintain her composure. Alexander noticed her emotion and asked with apparent concern if something was wrong, and Beatrice found herself explaining that no one had ever valued her mind this way, that her education had been something she pursued in secret because society deemed learned women unfeminine and unmarriageable, and he responded with an intensity that surprised her, that society was populated by fools who could not recognize worth when it stood before them. As they stood together in the quiet library with late afternoon light streaming through the windows, Beatrice felt the careful walls she had built around her heart begin to crack, and she understood that the danger she faced in this household was not to her body, but to the tender hopes she had thought long dead, because Alexander was showing her a vision of what life might be if someone truly saw her, and that vision was far more threatening to her equilibrium than any physical demand could ever be. The evening came, days after Beatrice had entered Alexander's household, when everything shifted between them with the weight of shared grief and the recognition of kindred suffering. And it began ordinarily enough with their customary dinner in the small dining room, where they had fallen into the comfortable rhythm of intellectual discourse. But this night Alexander seemed distracted and distant in a way she had not seen before. His responses brief, and his gaze turned often toward the darkening windows, as though he saw something there that troubled him deeply. When the final course was cleared, he did not rise as usual to escort her to the drawing-room, but instead remained seated with his wine-glass held loosely in his hand, and after a long silence he spoke into the quiet space between them, and said that he owed her an explanation for why he had intervened in her situation, why he had been willing to sacrifice his undefeated record and endure the scandal of taking her into his protection, and Beatrice felt her heart quicken because she sensed they were approaching territory far more dangerous than their previous conversations about literature and philosophy. He told her then about Catherine, his younger sister by 3 years, who had been lovely and spirited and trusting in the way young girls of good family were raised to be trusting, and how at 17 she had been courted by a nobleman of excellent reputation who had seemed honorable until he had lured her into a compromising situation and then abandoned her when the inevitable consequences became apparent, and the way Alexander's voice, fractured slightly on certain words, revealed the depth of pain that time had not diminished. Catherine had been cast out by society despite being the victim, labeled as loose and immoral, while her seducer faced no consequences beyond some brief gossip that faded within weeks, and Alexander had been away on the continent and had not known the full extent of her disgrace until he returned to find her isolated and despairing, and before he could arrange something to restore her position, or at least give her a life of dignity elsewhere, she had taken laudanum in quantities that could not have been accidental. He looked directly at Beatrice then with eyes that held old fury and fresh recognition, and said that when he saw her in the training hall, dignity intact despite the impossible situation she faced, resignation in her bearing but no self-pity, he had seen Catherine as she might have been if someone had intervened, and he could not turn away from the chance to prevent another woman from being destroyed by the casual cruelty of men like Carstairs, who viewed women as objects to be won and discarded without consequence. Beatrice felt tears slide down her cheeks as she listened, and she reached across the table to place her hand over his without thinking about propriety or caution, and she told him about her own losses, her father's disgrace when his business partner's fraud was discovered, and the way shame had eaten at him until his heart simply stopped. Her mother's death from fever, 2 years later, that Beatrice believed was partly from the loss of will to continue in a world that had become so diminished, and how she had tried to hold what remained of the family together only to watch George squander everything through weakness and poor judgment. They sat with hands joined across the polished table as shadows deepened in the room and no servant came to light more candles. And in that dimness, something fundamental shifted between them, the intellectual companionship they had built, transforming into emotional intimacy that was far more dangerous to both their carefully guarded hearts. And when Alexander finally spoke again, his voice was rough with feeling as he said that she was not alone anymore, that whatever happened at the end of the month, she would never face the world's cruelty, without someone who understood and valued her worth. And Beatrice knew in that moment that she was losing the battle to protect herself from hope and from the terrifying possibility of love. The transformation in their daily life together became apparent to everyone in the household as the third week of Beatrice's residence began, and what had started as formal cohabitation, governed by the terms of their arrangement, evolved into something that resembled genuine partnership, though neither of them spoke aloud about the shift that was occurring between them with each passing day. Alexander began including her in aspects of his life that he had previously kept separate, starting with an invitation to join him for an early morning ride in Hyde Park during the unfashionable hours when only serious equestrians were about. And though Beatrice had not ridden in years due to lack of funds to maintain horses, she found herself accepting because the prospect of spending more time in his company had become more compelling than her fear of making a poor showing. He arranged for a gentle mare from his stables, and they rode together through the misty morning park while London was still waking. And if Alexander noticed the curious stares and whispered conversations that followed in their wake, he gave no indication that society's judgment held any weight with him, and Beatrice found herself sitting straighter in the saddle because his indifference to scandal was teaching her a form of courage she had not known she possessed. The afternoon visits to his various properties became another shared ritual as Alexander began seeking her opinion on improvements to tenant housing and updates to the estate management, asking her perspective on matters that most men would never discuss with a woman. And Beatrice discovered that her years of managing a declining household had given her practical knowledge that he valued, and there was profound satisfaction in being consulted as though her thoughts held genuine worth rather than being dismissed as the province of a feminine mind unfit for serious consideration. Their evening conversations stretched later into each night as the topics deepened from literature and philosophy into more personal territory, sharing childhood memories and discussing their views on marriage and family and the nature of happiness. And Mrs. Carson remarked quietly to the housekeeper that she had never seen His Grace so animated or heard him laugh with such genuine warmth as he did in Miss Thornhill's company. The household staff had initially been uncertain about Beatrice's position and what her presence in the Duke's home signified, but they began to treat her with a deference that went beyond mere politeness as they observed how Alexander looked at her when she was not aware of his gaze, and how he would enter a room and immediately seek her out as though his eyes were drawn to her by some magnetic force he could not resist. Beatrice felt the weight of what was growing between them with a mixture of joy and terror, because she understood with increasing clarity that she was falling in love with Alexander Pembroke, not with his title or his wealth or even his intervention in her desperate situation, but with the man himself, the one who listened to her thoughts as though they mattered, and who had trusted her with his deepest grief, and who looked at her sometimes with an expression that made her breath catch in her throat. Yet the knowledge that their month together was more than half over cast a shadow over her growing happiness, and she found herself lying awake at night in her elegant suite of rooms calculating the remaining days, and wondering what would happen when the agreed-upon time expired, whether he would simply thank her for her company and send her away with a settlement that would ensure her material comfort, but leave her heart in ruins. And the prospect of leaving this life they were building together had become more frightening than any threat Carstairs had ever posed, because Alexander had shown her what genuine partnership might look like, and the loss of that vision would be a grief unlike any she had known before. The destruction of their careful peace came on the 17th day of her residence, when Alexander returned from his club in the late afternoon with an expression that Beatrice had not seen before, a cold fury that seemed to radiate from him in waves that made the servants step quietly aside as he passed through the entrance hall. And when he summoned her to his study, she went with a sense of dread that proved entirely justified, because he told her without preamble that Lord Carstairs had made a public challenge at White's that very afternoon. The words came hard and clipped as Alexander explained that Carstairs had stood before a room full of gentlemen and suggested that the previous boxing match had been fixed, that the Duke of Westmont had deliberately lost for reasons Carstairs claimed to know but would not specify, except to say they involved a woman of questionable virtue, and he had demanded a rematch to prove who was truly the superior fighter, and the challenge had been witnessed by enough members of society that refusing would be tantamount to admitting guilt and cowardice. Beatrice felt her blood turn cold because she understood immediately that this was Carstairs's revenge for being denied his prize, his way of striking at both her and Alexander by forcing the matter back into public scrutiny, and she found her voice to say that Alexander must refuse the challenge, that his honor did not require him to submit to the manipulation of a man like Carstairs, who had no honor himself. But Alexander's face remained set in lines of granite as he told her that she did not understand what was at stake, that a gentleman's reputation was everything, and if Carstairs's insinuations were allowed to stand unchallenged, then every business dealing and political alliance Alexander had built over years would be undermined by the suggestion that he could be bought or coerced into dishonest action. She felt something break inside her chest as she realized he was going to accept despite knowing the danger. And her voice rose as she accused him of valuing the opinion of men who were not worth his regard over the very real possibility of serious injury or worse, of choosing pride over sense and leaving her alone again just when she had begun to believe she might not have to face the world in solitude. Alexander's expression hardened further as he said that she was speaking from a feminine perspective that could not comprehend masculine honor, that some insults could not be borne regardless of the risk, and his words felt like a physical blow because they reduced her to exactly the category of limited understanding that society had always assigned her, as though their weeks of genuine partnership and intellectual equality had been merely his indulgence rather than true respect. The argument escalated with words that both would later regret, Beatrice saying that he was a fool to let Carstairs manipulate him into violence, Alexander responding that if she could not understand why he must defend both their honors, then perhaps she was not the woman he had believed her to be, and the rift that opened between them in that study felt as wide and unbridgeable as an ocean. When Alexander turned away from her to pen his acceptance of Carstairs' challenge, Beatrice left the room with tears streaming down her face, and the terrible knowledge that the man she loved was going to walk into danger because pride mattered more to him than her fear, and the joy that had been building between them over 17 days shattered like glass against the unyielding stone of masculine honor and societal expectations. The days following their argument passed with a chill that had nothing to do with the weather as Beatrice withdrew into a protective shell that she had not needed since arriving at Alexander's residence, and she found herself counting down the remaining time of their month together with a sense of inevitable loss rather than the eager anticipation that might have characterized these final days if their quarrel had not opened a chasm between them. She took her meals in her rooms rather than joining Alexander for dinner, claiming fatigue that fooled no one, and when she did encounter him in the hallways or drawing room, their conversations were painfully polite and formal, stripped of the warmth and genuine connection that had been building between them with such promise. Alexander noticed her distance with a growing sense of alarm that he tried to suppress behind a facade of ducal indifference, but in the privacy of his study, he found himself staring at correspondence without reading it, and wondering if her withdrawal signaled her eagerness to complete their bargain and return to her own life, free of his company and the complications his world had brought her. The possibility that she had merely been performing the role of interested companion out of obligation rather than genuine affection gnawed at him with surprising intensity, and his own fears began to surface. old wounds from his broken engagement that had taught him to distrust the motivations of those who sought his company, and question whether anyone could want him for himself rather than his title and wealth. He threw himself into preparations for the rematch with Carstairs, with grim determination that worried his trainer, who remarked that his Grace was fighting as though he had something to prove beyond the mere defense of his reputation. But Alexander could not explain even to himself that he was channeling his confusion and hurt into physical exertion because it was the only outlet he understood. Lady Margaret arrived on the 20th day for an afternoon visit and found Beatrice in the morning room pretending to read a book she had not turned a page of in half an hour, and the older woman took one look at her young friend's face and dismissed the hovering maid with a gesture before settling herself beside Beatrice with the determined air of someone prepared to administer uncomfortable medicine. The conversation that followed was gentle but unflinching, as Lady Margaret asked directly what had transpired between Beatrice and the Duke to transform the household's atmosphere from one of growing joy to this oppressive melancholy. And Beatrice found herself confessing not just the argument about the challenge, but the deeper truth she had been avoiding, that she had fallen completely in love with Alexander Pembroke, and feared desperately that he saw her merely as a charitable project, a damaged woman to be rescued rather than a partner to be cherished. Lady Margaret listened with the patience of long friendship before responding that Beatrice was being willfully blind if she could not see how the Duke looked at her, how his entire demeanor changed when she entered a room, how he had ordered his household rearranged to suit her comfort, and spent hours in conversation that he avoided with everyone else in society. And did she truly believe a man like Alexander Pembroke would devote such attention to someone he regarded merely as an object of charity? The words penetrated Beatrice's defensive walls enough to plant a seed of hope, and Lady Margaret pressed her advantage by urging her to speak honestly with Alexander before the rematch, to risk the vulnerability of confession because silence and withdrawal would certainly lead to loss, while honesty offered at least the possibility of understanding. Meanwhile, in his private gymnasium, Alexander drove himself through brutal training rounds and admitted to himself that he was fighting this rematch not just to defend his honor or even primarily to silence Carstairs' insinuations, but because the man had threatened Beatrice, and that offense could not stand, and somewhere in the weeks of her residence she had become infinitely precious to him in ways he was only beginning to understand and feared he might never have the chance to express. The evening before the rematch arrived with a heavy silence that hung over Alexander's residence like a physical weight, and as darkness fell, Beatrice sat in her suite, attempting to read, but finding the words swimming meaninglessly before her eyes, while she imagined all the ways the morning might end in tragedy, until a soft knock at her door made her start and call entrance, with a voice that trembled despite her efforts at composure. Alexander stood in the doorway, still dressed in his evening clothes, but with his cravat loosened and his dark hair slightly disheveled, as though he had been running his hands through it, and the expression on his face was so unguarded and uncertain that her breath caught, because she had never seen him look so vulnerable, not even when he had spoken of his sister's death, those weeks ago that now felt like a different lifetime. He asked quietly if he might come in, propriety be damned, because there were things he needed to say before the morning came, and Beatrice nodded wordlessly as she rose from her chair, her book falling forgotten to the floor as he entered and closed the door behind him with a decisive click that seemed to seal them away from the world and its expectations. Alexander crossed the room to stand before her and began to speak with an honesty that was clearly costing him something to express, telling her that he had been harsh and unfair in their argument, that he had accused her of not understanding when in truth she had understood all too well the futility of masculine pride, and he wanted her to know that he had accepted Carstairs' challenge, not primarily to defend his own reputation, but to defend hers, because the insinuations that man had made about her character could not be allowed to stand unchallenged regardless of the risk. Beatrice felt tears prick her eyes as she listened to him explain that somewhere during their 3 weeks together, she had become infinitely precious to him, that her good name mattered more than his own safety, and the realization that Carstairs might continue to speak of her with contempt and innuendo had made accepting the challenge not a matter of pride, but of protective fury that would not be denied. She found her voice to confess in turn that she feared losing him to violence, that the prospect of him being seriously injured, or worse for the sake of defending her against gossip she had long since learned to ignore, filled her with a terror she could barely articulate, because she had come to treasure their evenings of conversation and mornings of companionable silence, and the way he looked at her, as though she possessed actual value beyond her limited circumstances. Alexander stepped closer and took her hands in his with a gentleness that belied his reputation for physical prowess, promising her that he would be careful, that he had no intention of letting Carstairs harm him because he was fighting now for something far more precious than reputation or pride. He was fighting for the possibility of a future that had only recently begun to take shape in his imagination, but which he found he desired with surprising intensity. The air between them seemed to thicken with unspoken emotion as they stood hand in hand, both breathing faster, both leaning almost imperceptibly toward each other until their faces were mere inches apart, and Beatrice could see the gold flecks in his dark eyes and feel the warmth radiating from his body. The moment stretched and trembled on the edge of something irrevocable until Alexander's ingrained sense of propriety reasserted itself, and he stepped back with visible reluctance, releasing her hands and saying quietly that he should leave, that he would not compromise her further before he had earned the right to such intimacy through proper courtship and formal commitment. Beatrice nodded, though her body protested the distance between them, and as Alexander moved toward the door, he turned back one final time to say that after tomorrow, if he prevailed as he intended to, there were things he wished to discuss with her, arrangements he hoped to propose that went far beyond the terms of their original agreement, and she should know that the upcoming month's end held for him not relief, but dread, because the thought of her leaving his household had become intolerable. The dawn arrived cold and grey over London, as Beatrice dressed with trembling hands in Lady Margaret's guest chamber, having spent a sleepless night imagining every possible catastrophe that might befall Alexander in the coming hours, and by the time her friend's carriage arrived to convey them to the private venue where the rematch would take place, she felt hollow with dread and exhaustion. The location was a converted stable on the estate of a nobleman known for hosting such events away from the eyes of authorities who frowned upon pugilism despite its popularity among the upper classes. And as Beatrice and Lady Margaret entered the space already thick with tobacco smoke and masculine energy, she was struck by how different this felt from the first match she had attended, when she had been Carstairs's unwilling companion rather than a woman with everything to lose watching the man she loved risk himself for her sake. The crowd was smaller this time, perhaps 50 gentlemen who had received invitations to witness what was being whispered about as a settling of accounts, and Beatrice felt their eyes upon her as she took her place in the gallery, knowing that her presence had been remarked upon, and that speculation about her relationship with the Duke was the subject of much of the murmured conversation around her. Alexander arrived moments later through a side entrance flanked by his trainer, and even from a distance Beatrice could see the difference in him, the cold fury that had replaced his usual controlled composure, and when his eyes found hers across the crowded space, she saw in them a fierce determination that both reassured and terrified her. Carstairs entered from the opposite side with a swagger that struck Beatrice as performative, and she noticed that he had brought his own second, a brutish-looking man whose scarred face suggested extensive experience with violence, and the contrast between the two fighters was stark as they removed their shirts and began their preparations. Where Alexander's body was sculpted and powerful from disciplined training, Carstairs was softer, relying more on weight and reach than skill. But there was a cruelty in his expression that spoke of a willingness to inflict damage that went beyond the rules of sporting combat. The referee called them to the centre and reviewed the terms. Marquis of Queensberry rules with rounds of 3 minutes each, and as the two men touched gloves in a sportsmanship, Beatrice saw Carstairs lean close to whisper something that made Alexander's jaw tighten with barely suppressed rage. The bell rang, and the fight began with explosive violence that made Beatrice gasp and clutch Lady Margaret's hand, because this was nothing like the choreographed defeat she had witnessed before. This was Alexander fighting with the full force of his skill and fury combined, his fists moving with precise brutality that drove Carstairs back within seconds. But Carstairs revealed his true nature quickly, throwing an elbow that opened a cut above Alexander's eye and then following with a low blow that the referee either missed or chose to ignore. And Beatrice found herself on her feet, crying out in protest even as Alexander recovered and responded with a combination that sent Carstairs staggering. The rounds blurred together in a nightmare of violence as both men bloodied each other. But Alexander's superior training began to tell, as he systematically broke down Carstairs' defense with the methodical precision of someone who had studied this art for years. And in the 5th round he landed a devastating blow to the body, followed by a crushing right hand that sent Carstairs to the canvas where he remained beyond the count of 10. The crowd erupted in chaos as the referee declared Alexander the victor. But Beatrice heard none of it, because she was already pushing through the press of bodies toward the side entrance, where Alexander had staggered after the fight ended, her heart hammering with a mixture of relief and desperate need to reach him before he disappeared into whatever masculine ritual followed such violence. Lady Margaret called after her, but Beatrice ignored propriety and decorum entirely, as she finally broke through to find Alexander leaning against a wall while his trainer attempted to clean the blood from his face. And when he looked up and saw her standing there, the expression that crossed his battered features was so raw and unguarded that she felt something fundamental shift inside her chest. He dismissed his trainer with a curt word and straightened, despite the obvious pain the movement caused him, and Beatrice approached with hands already reaching for him even as she registered the split lip and swollen eye and the blood still seeping from the cut above his brow that would likely leave a scar. She asked where he was hurt, and her voice came out trembling despite her efforts at control. And Alexander shook his head as though injuries were irrelevant before saying he needed to speak with her, needed to tell her things that could not wait despite the impropriety of the moment and his disheveled state. Lady Margaret had caught up, and with remarkable presence of mind, suggested they use her carriage, which was waiting nearby, and within minutes Beatrice found herself seated beside Alexander in the dim privacy of the coach, while her friend had tactfully chosen to ride up top with the driver despite the morning chill. Beatrice pulled supplies from the small medical kit Lady Margaret kept in the carriage and began tending Alexander's wounds with hands that shook as she dabbed at the cut above his eye, and the intimacy of the act, touching his face with such care while he sat utterly still beneath her ministrations, felt more profound than anything that had passed between them before. Alexander caught her wrist gently and held it as he began to speak in a voice made rough by exertion and emotion, confessing that he had thrown the first fight not solely from honor, as he had allowed her to believe, but because from the moment he had seen her standing in his training hall with such desperate dignity despite her circumstances, he had been drawn to her in a way that defied rational explanation. The month he had demanded as payment was nothing more than an excuse to keep her near without the coercion that would have made such proximity dishonorable, and every day since she had entered his household had only deepened his certainty that she was the most remarkable woman he had ever encountered. Beatrice felt tears spill down her cheeks as she listened to him explain that watching her read in his library, hearing her opinions on estate management, discussing philosophy over dinner had become the moments he lived for, and the prospect of the month ending and her leaving had become unendurable. She set aside the cloth she had been using and took his face between her hands with a tenderness that acknowledged his injuries while conveying everything she felt, and whispered that she loved him, had fallen hopelessly in love with him despite every attempt to guard her heart against such dangerous hope. Alexander made a sound that was half laugh and half groan as he pulled her into his arms with a careful strength that minded his bruised ribs while still crushing her against his chest. And when he kissed her, it was tender and fierce simultaneously, tasting of blood and promise and the shattering of every barrier that had stood between them. The 3 days that followed their confession in the carriage passed in a strange, suspended state, where Alexander recovered from his injuries while Beatrice remained at Lady Margaret's residence to preserve some measure of propriety, though such considerations felt absurd given all that had already transpired between them. And on the evening of the 3rd day, a note arrived requesting Beatrice's presence at Alexander's London residence for a private dinner in the garden that very night. Lady Margaret helped her dress in a gown of pale blue silk that had been part of her trousseau from years ago when such things had still seemed possible, and as Beatrice was conveyed through the spring evening toward the man she loved, she felt a trembling anticipation that was entirely different from the dread that had accompanied her first arrival at his household those weeks before. Alexander met her at the garden entrance himself, rather than allowing servants to escort her, and the cut above his eye had begun to heal into what would indeed become a permanent scar, a mark he would carry always as evidence of the violence he had endured for her sake, and the tenderness in his expression as he offered his arm made her heart contract with almost painful intensity. He led her through paths lined with early roses to a secluded corner where a small table had been set with silver and candles, intimate and private, despite being outdoors, and the household staff who served them did so with swift efficiency before withdrawing to leave them alone beneath the deepening sky. They spoke of small things at first as they ate, the careful conversation of two people who had confessed love, but had not yet determined what shape their future would take, and Beatrice felt her nervousness increase as the meal progressed because she understood that this evening held significance beyond simple companionship. When the final course had been cleared, and they were left with only wine and the sound of evening birds settling for the night, Alexander reached across the table to take her hand with a solemnity that made her breath catch, and he began to speak in a voice that was steady despite the emotion she could see in his eyes. He said that the original wager that had brought her into his life had been born of desperation and manipulation, a corrupt bargain that should never have been necessary, but that he wanted to make her a different proposition now, one founded not on debt or obligation, but on genuine love and mutual respect. He acknowledged that scandal surrounded them both, that society would judge their union as improper regardless of how they proceeded, and that he found he cared nothing at all for the opinions of people who would have left her to Carstairs's mercy while congratulating themselves on their own virtue. What he offered her now was not protection or rescue, but true partnership, a marriage between equals where her voice would matter as much as his own, where the intelligence and strength of character he had witnessed over their weeks together would be honored rather than suppressed by the strictures that governed conventional unions. He asked if she would consent to become his wife, not because circumstances demanded it, but because they had found in each other something rare and precious, and as he spoke Beatrice felt joy rising in her chest like a physical force, tears spilling down her cheeks even as she smiled, with a radiance she had not known herself capable of expressing. Her acceptance came in a voice that trembled, but held absolute certainty, and when Alexander rose and drew her to her feet, to kiss her with a tenderness that acknowledged both the wounds he still carried and the future they would build together, Beatrice understood that her fortune had reversed not through passive rescue, but through the mutual recognition of two people who saw clearly what the other truly was and chose to bind their lives together despite every obstacle society might place in their path. The announcement of their engagement appeared in the morning papers exactly 2 days after Alexander's proposal, and by afternoon the news had spread through London society like wildfire, igniting reactions that ranged from scandalized disapproval to reluctant admiration for what some termed the most romantic story of the season, though Beatrice understood that romance was often the veneer polite society applied to situations they found simultaneously shocking and fascinating. Lady Margaret arrived at Alexander's residence, where Beatrice had taken up temporary quarters in a separate wing, to find her friend sorting through calling cards that had begun arriving in alarming quantities, and her triumphant expression suggested she viewed the engagement as vindication of her faith in both Beatrice's worth and Alexander's character, despite the unconventional path that had brought them together. The cards represented a curious mixture of society's response, some from matrons who had previously cut Beatrice entirely, but now sought to re-establish connection with the future Duchess of Westmont, others from genuinely kind souls who wished them happiness, and a few from those emboldened to express disapproval through the thin disguise of concern for propriety and the Duke's reputation. George Thornhill presented himself that same afternoon with an expression of such profound shame and gratitude that Beatrice found herself embracing her foolish brother despite all the pain his weakness had caused, and when he stammered his thanks to Alexander for saving both his sister and the family honor, the Duke's response was cold enough to make clear that forgiveness would be earned through changed behavior rather than granted through words alone. Alexander's own social circles reacted with typical aristocratic complexity, some lords and ladies expressing outrage that a duke would ally himself with a woman of compromised reputation regardless of the circumstances, while others found the entire affair refreshingly free of the calculated marriage negotiations that typically governed their class. And Alexander dismissed the disapproving faction with such icy contempt that within days it became clear that maintaining his friendship required accepting his choice of bride without reservation. The most difficult moments came when women who had once been Beatrice's friends before her family's decline began calling with congratulations that barely masked their envy and confusion at her reversal of fortune, and she received them with a grace that acknowledged neither their previous abandonment nor their current opportunism, presenting instead a dignified warmth that made clear she would be a duchess who remembered what it meant to be powerless. Alexander stood beside her through every social trial those weeks brought, his presence a statement that they faced society's judgment as a united force, rather than as individuals who might be separated by sufficient pressure. And when the Earl of Pemberton made an unfortunate comment at his club about damaged goods, Alexander's response was delivered with such quiet menace that the man left London entirely rather than face the Duke's continued displeasure. The wedding preparations proceeded with surprising swiftness, given Alexander's determination to formalize their union before further scandal could accumulate, and though tradition might have called for a grand ceremony befitting his rank, they chose instead intimacy over spectacle, planning a small gathering at his country estate, where genuine affection rather than social obligation would determine the guest list. And as the date approached, Beatrice found herself less anxious about society's continued gossip than filled with profound anticipation for the moment when she would speak vows that transformed a wager born of desperation into a bond chosen freely by two people who had found in each other something worth defying the world to claim. The wedding took place on the 17th of June at Alexander's country estate in Hampshire, where the ancient stone chapel stood surrounded by gardens that had burst into full summer bloom, as though nature itself celebrated the union of two people who had found each other through such unlikely and scandalous circumstances. The guest list numbered only 32 souls, each one present because of genuine affection rather than social obligation. And this select group included Lady Margaret Sinclair, whose knowing smile suggested she had foreseen this outcome from the moment Beatrice first confessed her impossible situation, George Thornhill, whose continued sobriety and evident determination to rebuild his character had begun to soften Alexander's coldness toward him, and several of Alexander's closest friends who had proven their loyalty by accepting his choice of bride without reservation or judgment. Beatrice wore a gown of ivory silk that Lady Margaret had commissioned from London's finest modiste. The design simple rather than ornate, but cut with such skill that it transformed Beatrice's slender figure into something ethereal. And when she walked down the chapel aisle on George's arm, she carried white roses from Alexander's own gardens, their perfume mingling with the scent of beeswax candles and old stone. Alexander waited at the altar in formal dress that emphasized both his aristocratic bearing and the physical power that had played such an unexpected role in their story. And the healing scar above his eye caught the light filtering through stained glass as he watched Beatrice approach with an expression that made several guests reach for handkerchiefs, because the love visible on the Duke's usually austere face was almost too intimate to witness. The vicar who performed the ceremony was an elderly man who had known Alexander since childhood, and who spoke the traditional words with a warmth that acknowledged how these particular vows carried weight beyond convention. And when Beatrice and Alexander exchanged their promises, their voices were steady, despite the emotion that made the air in the small chapel feel charged with significance, as a wager born of desperation and manipulation was transformed through their free choice into a bond that defied every cynical expectation society might hold. The moment when Alexander placed his mother's ring on Beatrice's finger felt like the closing of one story and the opening of another, and when the vicar pronounced them husband and wife, and Alexander kissed his bride with a tenderness that acknowledged everything they had endured to reach this moment, the small congregation's applause seemed to celebrate not merely a marriage, but a victory over the corrupt system that had nearly destroyed them both. The wedding breakfast that followed was held in the estate's formal gardens, under a canopy of white silk, and the champagne toasts spoke of love, conquering adversity, and honor triumphing over shame, while Beatrice sat beside her new husband feeling a happiness so profound it seemed impossible that months earlier she had stood in a gentleman's club, accepting terms that would have meant her ruin. As the afternoon lengthened toward evening, and the guests began departing with warm embraces and promises to visit, Alexander led Beatrice to the waiting carriage that would carry them to the coast, where a house overlooking the sea awaited their wedding journey. And as they drove away from the estate with the sunset painting the sky in shades of gold and rose, Beatrice leaned against Alexander's shoulder, knowing that she had gambled everything on a desperate hope, and won not merely survival, but a love that recognized and honored everything she truly was. Autumn arrived at the Hampshire estate with a painter's touch, transforming the ancient oaks into towers of amber and crimson, and it was here, in the season of harvest and gathering, that Beatrice Pembroke, now Duchess of Westmont for exactly 1 year and 3 months, found herself standing in the midst of the tenant cottages, overseeing improvements that Alexander had insisted she direct, according to her own judgment about what families truly needed, rather than what aristocratic tradition might dictate was appropriate charity. The changes she had implemented spoke of practical wisdom born from her own experience of reduced circumstances, with proper chimneys installed to replace those that smoked, windows enlarged to let in health-giving light, and kitchen gardens established so that each family might supplement their provisions with fresh vegetables, even in winter months when coin became scarce. Alexander watched her from the slight rise where he stood beside his estate manager, and the expression on his face carried a contentment that would have astonished the London society that had once known him only as the austere duke, whose dedication to pugilism seemed his sole passion. Beyond ducal duty, though in truth his relationship with fighting had transformed into something gentler since his marriage. As he now spent his mornings in the private gymnasium he had built, teaching discipline and self-respect to young men from the village, rather than preparing for competitions that no longer held meaning. Their daily rhythms had settled into patterns of deep companionship, with breakfast taken together while discussing estate matters or the books they read to each other in the evenings, afternoons often spent in separate pursuits, but always reuniting for dinner where conversation flowed with the ease of two minds that had discovered profound compatibility, and nights that brought intimacies. Beatrice had never imagined during those desperate days when she had accepted a wager that should have meant her ruin, but had instead become the strange path by which she found the deepest love she could have conceived. The household staff had long since ceased viewing the Duchess as the scandalous woman whose arrival had shocked them all, and instead regarded her with genuine affection, born from observing how she had brought warmth and purpose to rooms that had felt cold during the years when Alexander lived in solitary dedication to maintaining appearances while nursing private grief. And even the neighboring families who had initially whispered about the irregular circumstances of the marriage now spoke of the Pembrokes with admiration for how they had defied convention to claim happiness. As October deepened toward November, and Beatrice stood reviewing plans for a new school building she hoped to establish by spring, she felt the unmistakable stirring of new life within her body, and knew with certainty that she carried Alexander's child, a realization that filled her with wonder, not merely at the prospect of motherhood, but at how completely her life had transformed from that night when she had stood in a gentleman's club, accepting terms that were meant to destroy her, but had instead set in motion events that led here to this moment of profound fulfillment, standing on land that was now her home beside a man who loved not what society deemed valuable, but who she truly was beneath all the judgments and limitations the world had tried to impose upon her worth. There are stories we tell ourselves about risk and reward, about the gambles we take when circumstance leaves us no choice but to place our trust in outcomes we cannot control. And if you have listened to Beatrice and Alexander's journey from that desperate night in a gentleman's club through the transformation of a wager meant to destroy into a bond that defied every expectation, then perhaps you have recognized something of your own story in theirs, because we all face moments when the world judges us by measurements that have nothing to do with our true worth, and we must decide whether to accept those judgments or to risk everything on the belief that somewhere beyond the cruelty of arbitrary limitations there exists recognition of who we really are beneath the surface. Beatrice Thornhill entered a gaming hell, believing she had nothing left to lose, and discovered she had everything to gain, not through rescue or protection, but through the rarer gift of being truly seen by someone who valued dignity and intelligence and courage over the superficial attributes that society prizes. And Alexander Pembroke, who had isolated himself behind walls of duty and grief, found that genuine connection required the vulnerability of recognizing another person's worth, even when doing so meant defying convention and sacrificing pride. Their story reminds us that transformation often comes through the very circumstances that seem designed to break us, that the moments of deepest desperation can become doorways to futures we never imagined possible if we maintain our dignity in adversity and remain open to the unexpected forms that salvation might take. It is never too late for your life to change, Never too late to be recognized for your true value rather than the limitations others have placed upon you. Never too late to find the love that sees beyond surface judgments, to honor the person you have always been beneath the weight of disappointment and reduced circumstances. If Beatrice's journey has touched your heart, if Alexander's transformation from isolated duty to genuine partnership has moved you, then know that their story stands as testament to what becomes possible when we refuse to accept the corrupt measurements by which an unjust world calculates worth, and instead insist on our right to dignity and connection and love, regardless of age or fortune, or the scandals that circumstance has attached to our names. I invite you to join me again for more stories of overlooked hearts finding recognition, of love that transcends the arbitrary barriers society constructs, of transformation that proves it is never too late to claim the happiness that seemed forever beyond reach. Subscribe to hear more tales of those who gambled everything on their own worth and discovered that the greatest victories come not from playing by rules designed to keep us confined, but from having the courage to rewrite the terms entirely. And when you face your own moments of impossible choice, remember Beatrice standing in that club, accepting terms that should have meant her ruin, and remember that sometimes the path to joy leads through the very thing we most fear, that dignity maintained in darkness eventually finds the light it deserves, and that true love recognizes and honors the value that corrupt systems try to deny, just as Alexander and Beatrice found each other through a wager that transformed from an instrument of shame into the unlikely foundation of a partnership built on mutual respect and genuine recognition, and the deepest love that defies every cynical expectation about what is possible when two people choose to see each other truly.